interesting for the different departments and, of course, for the university. And so there was a contest, and we're very happy that Dr. Luis Javier, as well as Professor Cecilia Coronado from the Humanities Department, for reasons to be here today, won this funding to investigate a little bit more on the migration thing. So it shows that it is a very important project, not only for the humanities, for the philosophy, of course, but for the whole university. So it's easy, I think, to see, to realize that one turns on the TV, one reads a little bit newspapers, migration is all over the place, and it seems to be one of the most politically correct subjects we can discuss. But at the same time, we can see that the public policies and political speeches are going exactly the other way around. So it's not clear what the position of the government and of the society has to be in this subject. So we're very happy to have here people with very serious backgrounds, with solid careers, who may discuss this in a very respectful way, to have a philosophical and a very serious debate, getting away from the just common sense and easy speech of saying we have to be nice and we have to accept everybody and not to take care of all the problems that come within, and to have real philosophical faculty. So we're very happy to have you, and at the same time, I hope that for the students, it's going to be also very clear that it is important that philosophy can move from the desks or the library to the public discussion, and that there is no risk of, if you have a very solid education, you can do it without compromising strong and very hard philosophical discussion. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope you have a very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Good morning to everyone. I will read because my English is not as good as Maria Elena. I am here in the name of the Department of Humanities at the Universidad Panamericana, and especially in the name of Cecilia Coronado, researcher of the same academic instance, and one of the main researchers of the project in which this workshop is integrated. Sadly, Cecilia cannot be here, Maria Elena said, because she had to undergo an unexpected surgery the last few days. For the Department of Humanities, this project about migration and cosmopolitanism is very relevant. As an essentially interdisciplinary instance in this university, because we teach philosophy, history, and theology to non-philosophers, non-historians, non-theologians, this kind of academic activities is precisely what this department is called to be part of. We are really committed to the idea that you cannot teach humanities as a purely abstract subject. To teach humanities is also to approach real and urgent concerns as those put forward by the problem of migration and the ethics of borders and of immigration controls. Therefore, we are very happy to be part of this workshop, and we are thankful to all the experts who are here, to the authorities of the Universidad Panamericana, which made possible the entire project through a research grant, and to our friends of the Faculty of Philosophy, especially to Maria Elena as Dean of the Faculty, and to Luis Javier, who shares the direction of the project with Cecilia. We are very honored to collaborate with you and to learn from you, and to welcome all the speakers of this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to start with our first speaker, that is Arash Abizadeh. Thank you very much for coming, Arash. So Arash Abizadeh is professor of political philosophy at McGill University. He has published relevant works on history of political philosophy, contemporary political theory, nationalism, democratic theory, discourse ethics. His current research focuses on democratic theory in relation to questions of identity, nationalism, cosmopolitanism, political legitimation, and immigration and boundaries, 17th and 18th century philosophy, particularly Hobbes and Rousseau, and Habermas and German critical theory. So welcome, Professor Abizadeh. Please go ahead. We need to talk to the mic.
Oye, hay gente afuera todavía.
May I ask the translators? ¿Alguien necesita la traducción?
Aquí donde estamos nosotros, aquí se les da a los
Bueno, si alguien requiere traducción simultánea, aquí hay algunos que pueden solicitar ahí en la cabina. Y si no saben cómo tomar Thank you. Sorry,
Thank you very much for having me. Muchas gracias por la invitación, Luis Javier, y estoy muy contento de estar aquí. Es mi primera vez en México y estoy muy contento. Y pienso que es mejor por todos por aquí que hablo en inglés. Entonces, excuse my Spanish. I will continue in English so that everybody can understand better what I'm going to argue. What I want to start with is a general description, I think, of the nature of debates about migration and immigration in literature in political philosophy, which is focused a great deal on whether or not states have the right to keep people out, whether they have the right to coercively regulate their borders, and whether, on the other hand, people have a right to cross borders when they wish. So many people have argued that there's a human right, for example, to cross borders. There's a human right to movement. And in a way, what I want to do is I want to change the question a little bit. And I want to change the question not to the substantive question of what rights people have and what kind of regime of border control, whether it should be open, whether it should be porous, closed, and rather to ask a question about authority and procedure and decision making. So when there's disagreement in first order political philosophical questions about what the right answer should be, there's a further question, which is a second order procedural question, is when there's disagreement, who has the right to decide? And it's that authority question that I want to focus on here. And in particular, I want to focus on the kind of answer that normative democratic theory has traditionally given to this second order question. And in particular, according to normative democratic theory, there's a long-standing tradition that says that those individuals who are themselves subject to the exercise of political power are precisely those who have the right to participate in determining the laws that regulate how power is exercised over them. So in a way, if you want a slogan, democratic theory slogan has traditionally been the subjects of political power should be citizens who can participate in determining the laws that govern them. And what I want to do is to point out a fairly radical implication that this would have for thinking about regimes of border control. So here's the general thesis that I want to defend, and the nature of the paper, this is kind of an old argument that I've made, and what I'd like to do is give you a kind of taste of what the argument is, and then to consider some potential objections to the argument. So the main thesis is that a state's regime of border control is democratically legitimate only if both citizens and non-citizens have rights of political participation in determining the nature of that regime of border control. So this is quite radical because, of course, this is not the way that states organized in the post-Westphalian order. Typically, states assert the unilateral right to determine their own regimes of border control. And if there is anybody who's given a right to participate in the determination of the laws of that state, it's going to be their own citizens. That's the typical lay of the land today. And in a way, what I'm trying to argue is that that's inconsistent with the democratic theory of legitimacy. So I'll give you the normative premise. I've already foreshadowed it. It's a very simple argument. It consists of two premises. The first one, you can see this on your outline. The normative premise is that the exercise of political power is democratically legitimate only if it receives a democratic justification to all those who are subject to it. Okay, that's what I was saying earlier, that it's democratically justified to those who are subject to it. Notice that what I'm appealing to is what you might call an all-subjected principle, and not, there's a different principle that's often discussed in democratic theory, and this is the all-affected interests principle. This is not the principle that I'm appealing to. So I'm not saying that whoever's interests are affected by, let's say, a state's institution, a state's political decision-making has the right to participate in its institutions. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying all those who are subject to the exercise of political power are, this is what triggers a right of democratic state. And I can say a little bit more about that premise, exactly how I think about it, and what I mean by that in the question and answer period, which hopefully will. By the way, can you tell me once I've spoken for about 30 minutes so that I have a sense of when to stop? So the second premise of the argument is a non-normative, it's a descriptive premise, and that is that regimes of border control subject both citizens and foreigners to the coercive exercise of political power. Okay, so I think this is fairly straightforward, and I can give you, I will elaborate on this premise a little bit more and give you a sense of what I mean by being subject to the coercive exercise of political power. But basic intuition here is, well, I'll tell you right now, I mean, I think of being subject to coercion, there's three different ways that you can be subject to coercion. One is that you are subject to threats, and in particular you're subject to threats of violence, if you don't comply with some directive. Another way that you can be subject to coercion by the state is that state agents directly manipulate the space around your body, or manipulate your body itself. That's direct coercion. The first form, which is the standing threat that the law imposes and directs towards people, is what I would think of as a communicative form of coercion. And thirdly, another way that you can be subject to coercion is if the state authorizes its agents to invigilate your actions. So they are watching to see what you will do, and if you do something that is contrary to the directive, at that point they will engage in direct coercion. Okay, so those are the three different kinds of coercion that I have in mind. Being subject to coercion doesn't require actually that anybody engage in direct manipulation of your body. There can just be a standing threat. If you do X, you will be shot. If you do X, you will be apprehended, and so on. Okay, so these are ways of being subject to coercion, which may never trigger direct physical coercion against you. And so you combine this with the initial normative premise, and what you get is precisely the conclusion. You get the conclusion is the thesis that I advanced in the beginning, which is that the democratic legitimacy of a regime of border control requires democratic justification to both citizens and to foreigners. And by democratic justification, I'll give you a precise formulation of what I mean by this, but the basic idea is that something is only democratically justified to people if they have rights of political participation in the processes that determine the laws in question. Okay, so notice that this is not an open borders argument. I'm not arguing that people have the right to move wherever they want, because it's not a first order question that I'm dealing with, it's a second order question. I'm asking the question about who has the right to decide. Perhaps through this process we're going to end up with fairly closed borders. But the point is that the determination of what kind of borders there are, from a democratic perspective, it seems to me, requires that not just citizens unilaterally decide this against the foreigners on whom they are coercively imposing this border regime. So there are a few objections that I'd like to consider to this kind of argument. The first kind of objection that I think probably is very intuitive is the notion, it appeals to an ideal of self-determination. So it's a very familiar thought that democratic theory is committed to this idea of self-determination, that a people should be able to determine the terms of its own political association, and that, furthermore, one of the ways that it can determine the terms of its own political association is precisely with whom it is going to associate. And therefore, it looks as if a right of self-determination seems to imply that you be able to decide who you are going to let in and who you are not. And this is a very familiar argument. Michael Walzer, for example, thinks that this is right. In fact, thinks that this is the heart of the idea of self-determination. And my response to this kind of objection to my thesis about who has a right to participate in the decision-making process is that when it comes to the question of the boundaries of decision-making procedures, in other words, who has the right to participate in deciding things, that to appeal to a right of collective self-determination actually begs the question of who the relevant self is. Okay? Because that's precisely what we're asking. When we're asking, who is the self, the collective self, that gets to decide what the regime of border control is? And then someone says, well, but we have a right of self-determination. That's exactly what the question is. So you can't just sort of parachute a collective self into the answer when we're, as a kind of presupposed answer, unless you want to argue in a circle. Right? So that's what I mean by begging the question. So you can't take the boundaries of the collective self for granted when the question is about the legitimacy of those boundaries, which is my question. So self-determination, as I understand it, actually and I'm thinking here of democratic self-determination, the democratic principle of self-determination, as I understand it, is actually a demand for democratic legitimacy. It's a demand that those people who are subject to political power be precisely those who participate in the political processes that determine how it is exercised over them. And that's just the premise that's the normative premise that I started out with. That's the first premise of the argument that I started out with. So again, I'm talking about a democratic conception of self-determination and not a nationalist or a national conception of self-determination. In other words, I'm not talking about a conception that says there's a collective self that is pre-politically determined by ethnic or cultural ties that people have. I am operating in the realm of democratic theory for the purposes of this discussion. So what I've said is that the laws are democratically legitimate only if they've received a democratic justification, and now I want to elaborate on what I mean by a democratic justification. The laws have a democratic justification only if, and I think I've put in the 3 conditions there on the handout, if they are the outcome of procedures in which all those who are subject to the exercise of power have the opportunity to participate on terms that are consistent with respect for their equality and their freedom. Okay. So that's the first part. Or if those laws in question are actually constitutive conditions of the procedures of democratic justification. So just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, for example, one of the constitutive conditions of democratic procedures is that people have the right of political participation. Right? So if you have, through a democratic procedure, if you end up with a decision to disenfranchise half of the population, that is democratically illegitimate, even though it satisfies, if you like, 1A on the handout. Nevertheless, it does not satisfy number 2. Okay, so it has to, you have to meet those conditions. And furthermore, sorry, I think I confused things, but I was actually talking about the third part. So it also has to be the case that the laws in question do not constitutively undermine or negate procedures of democratic justification. So that's what I had in mind, is that if you disenfranchise people. So for example, in South African apartheid, democratic legitimacy requires self-determination, but not just the self-determination of whites. It requires the self-determination of all those who are subject to the exercise of political power in the South African state, which includes blacks. Okay, so the notion of self-determination is, if you like, just is the requirement of democratic legitimacy, okay, which I'm trying to specify in those 3 conditions. Now notice that I've also put in there a clause that says, on terms consistent with respect for equality and freedom. On terms consistent with equality has important implications. One of the implications, and what I mean by this, is equal treatment. Is treatment as an equal and not equal treatment. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. I have 3 children of different ages and sizes. If I were to treat all of them the same, what I would do is I would get them each a chair of the same height when we sit at the table. But what that would mean is that my youngest wouldn't be able to eat food. Because, he's the shortest. So he needs something. In order to treat him as an equal, I actually have to not treat them equally, in the sense of treat them the same. So that's what I mean by equality, is treatment as an equal that is consistent with perhaps conditions that are specific to them. And what this means is that it's a rejection of the idea of formal procedural equality as being the only requirement of treatment as an equal. In other words, this may mean, for example, under some conditions, that simple majoritarianism is not equivalent to the proper procedure of democratic equality. So, for example, in my country, we have an entrenched minority. We have an entrenched French-speaking minority in the country that will always be outvoted on cultural questions, linguistic questions, in the Canadian Federation. And so what that means is that treating Francophones as an equal may require departures from purely formal procedural equality. And that's precisely what, for example, federalist arrangements are designed to do. They are departures from procedural equality, but they are not inconsistent with a democratic commitment to the participation of people on terms that respect them as equals. Okay? Why? Because if you just had purely formal procedural equality, the outcomes would systematically be biased in favor of one group rather than another over a long period of time. Okay, so these are some of the conditions. So what that means is that I'm rejecting the idea of simple majoritarianism. This is important in the question of borders because sometimes people say, well, if you're thinking about democratizing borders, that basically means that China gets to decide the borders for the whole world, right? And that's not where the argument goes, because it's not an argument about simple majoritarianism. It's got built into it substantive conditions about treatment of people as equals in the specification of the democratic procedures in which people have the right to participate. Okay, so, however, one way to try and press further this argument about self-determination is in a slightly different way, try to press the objection against my view, is by appeal to a notion of freedom of association. And this is an argument that a US political philosopher, Kit Wellman, has made, that precisely that there is this right of freedom of association that people have that gives them the right to decide who the members of their own political community are unilaterally without any input from foreigners. Okay, and that's a challenge to my argument, and that's what I want to address for most of the rest of my comments here. So I'll give you the outline of Wellman's argument, and then I'll tell you which premise I want to put pressure on. So Wellman argues that there is a fundamental, freedom of association. There's a right of association, is how I would refer to it now. And the first premise is that this right of association is grounded in fundamental human interests that we have to freely associate with people with whom we choose to associate, and that this right of association includes a right to dissociate, to not associate with people that we don't want to. Okay, so Wellman's basic intuition is going to be, just as we have the right to decide on who we're going to associate with for the purposes of marriage, and we have the right not to dissociate with those who we don't want to get married to for the purpose of marriage, so too does a political community have the right to decide on who it wants to associate with in the political sphere, who it wants to allow as a member of its political community. So the first premise is that we have a right of association that includes a right to dissociate. The second premise is that not just individuals, but also groups may collectively bear the right of association. The third premise is that a political community that is organized as a legitimate state has that collective right of association.
And the fourth premise is that a political community's right of association implies the right of unilateral restrictions on migration and entry into the political community. It's the move from 3 to 4 that I'm going to put pressure on. And in fact, the defense of 3 itself. So I want to ask, what's the justification for the third premise? Remember, the third premise, I think you have it there on your handout, is that a politically organized as a legitimate state has the right of association, including the right to dissociate. That's very important. Wellman's justification for this is that it's a normative premise that is needed to explain some very basic intuitions that people have about interstate relations. So, for example, we need that premise to explain why forcible annexation is wrong. So if the USA decided to forcibly annex Canada or Mexico, what explains the wrongness of that forcible annexation is precisely this right of association and dissociation that is being violated on Wellman's account, that is captured by premise 3. So his point is that we need premise 3, this collective right of association and dissociation for states, in order to explain why it would be wrong for the US to annex its neighbors. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so I want to concede that much of the argument. And what I want to say is that that's not going to get you premise 4, which is this conclusion. Okay? Why is that? And I'm going to do this by way of analyzing this notion of a right of association. So what is the right of association? Well, one thing that we can say about the right of association is that it has a certain function. And its function is to regulate at least 2 spheres of 2 aspects of human association that are relevant. One is the very fact of contact and interaction in space and time. Right? So we're concerned about the way in which we might interact with each other in space and time, and you might be concerned that who you're going to interact with in space and time. You might want to have some kind of say over who you get to do that with. The other is the mutual special obligations that can arise from our interactions and our relationships with people. So again, you can think of a marriage here, right? So one of the things that a right association does is that this right that you have to decide who you're going to get married to or who you're not going to be married with is a way of regulating who you're going to spend your time in your home with, right? Who you're going to interact with. And it's also a way of regulating who you're going to develop these obligations that arise from being in an intimate relationship with somebody. Okay, so those are the 2 aspects that a right of association is meant to regulate. So, and one of the things that it's meant to regulate about this is coercion. So I want to focus on this now. It's the coercion regulating function of the right of association. So one of its functions is to regulate how coercion is used over interaction and in the way in which special obligations arise between people. So the right of association, I'm going to suggest to you, always includes 2 components. First of all, it includes a negative claim right against being coerced to interact with potential associates or against refraining from interacting. So for example, this negative claim right that I have, that is part of my right of association, says that I can't be forced to marry somebody against my will, for example. That's what a right of association is supposed to protect. I can't be coerced to become a member of a particular political party against my own will. That's what the right of association is meant to protect. I can join with others without coercion to form a political party. Right? That's a negative claim right that I have against others from coercively preventing me from doing so, or forcing me to do so. So that's the negative claim right. There's also an immunity right. What I mean there is that you have an immunity against acquiring special obligations towards coercively imposed associates. So if of those friendships, I make promises to people on the basis, or that I create expectations that now incur on me new obligations as a result of my own decisions about who to develop intimate friendships with. Okay, that's the project enabling function here. Now, you may lack this component, you may lack that right, for example, or may be restricted. For example, you might not have the power to acquire certain obligations towards, say, criminal associates. You might have decided you want to associate with these criminals, but actually you don't develop these moral obligations towards them. Maybe, in fact, your obligation is to betray them and to, report them to the authorities or whatever, right? So there may be restrictions on this third component of a right of association. And the fourth is, in the technical language that is sometimes used, it's a paired liberty right or a privilege not to interact with or not to take on special obligations towards special associates. Okay, so I might have a kind of liberty to decide I don't want to associate with these people. I might have a liberty to decide I do want to associate with these people and take on obligations. You might lack this. There's cases where, for example, it might not be morally free. You might not be morally free. And what I mean by that is you might have a moral duty, for example, to refrain from joining racist organizations. Okay, so that's a moral duty that you might have, to refrain from that kind of association. Okay. Now here's where things get very important for Wellman's argument. We have to distinguish everything that I've said so far from two other things. These are also coercion regulating potential function of a right of association. Sometimes you might think that a right of association also gives you a liberty right to use coercion against others to prevent them from associating with you. Okay. But notice that this is different than the claim right that you have that others not coerce you into associating with them. Here now we're talking about a liberty that you have to use coercion to force others to associate with you or not to associate with you. Right? And that's the second part, is the liberty right to use coercion to compel others to associate with yourself. These are distinct. So to give you an example, you can imagine there's a religious group who has who deems that all those people who don't join with them in worship are impure in some way, that they're ritually impure, and it's very important for them to not interact with infidels. Okay, so that's the kind of idea that they might have. And this religious group might then have three options. It might say, well, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to coercively prevent anybody who is not one of our fellow worshipers from entering into space that would enable them to interact with us. We're going to coercively prevent them from entering. Second, they might coercively force those others to worship with them so that they can get rid of the ritual impurity. Or they might face unwelcome interaction with them. But notice that this is not coerced interaction. No one's coercing the interaction, it's just unwelcome. There's no use of word. They just happen to be in the same space, and here they are. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay. So, moving back to the question of borders and Wellman's argument for why it is that a political community has the right to unilaterally decide and coercively prevent people from entering its territory in a way that leads to them associating with them in their political community. And you might think, right, in the background here is a general idea is that when people are on the same territory in a democracy, that starts to trigger rights of democratic participation. There's a kind of a background assumption here that I think is important to make explicit, right? Insofar, because it's clear to everybody that when you're on the territory, even if you're not a citizen, you're subject to the coercive exercise of political power. So even Michael Walzer has an argument for why it is that when you're in the territory of the democratic polity, this should eventually lead to democratic rights of participation. Right? So that's one of the background assumptions. Okay, so moving back to this. What I want to suggest to you is that Wellman's argument for why a right of association yields a right to coercively prevent others from entering into association with you actually conflates the claim right against coercive association, which was A, and the immunity right against coercively imposed obligations, which was B, with E, which is the liberty to use coercion to prevent association. All that we need to explain what's wrong with the US annexing Mexico or Canada is A and B. We need to show that people have a claim right against being forced coercively to associate with others. That's all that we need. But what Wellman needs is to show that the state has the right to coercively prevent others from associating with them, which is a different thing. In other words, the argument that he's giving us for premise 3 doesn't give us his conclusion. So, I mean, you were mentioning methodologically what's the use of philosophy, and I want to suggest to you one of the uses of philosophy is to analyze premises to see where the argument goes wrong, and to attack the argument by carefully considering what the premises behind the argument is, and that's what I'm suggesting. So, in a nutshell, granting premise 3 does not give us premise 4, which is what he needs to give an argument or an objection to the kind of argument that I'm giving you here. So two more. How much time has passed? So I've talked for 15 minutes only? Okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and consider two other kinds of objections. And the reason why it's important for me to consider all these objections is because I understand that the thesis that I'm advancing is very counterintuitive to many people, and it is, it's a radical thesis. And the argument that I gave for it is very simple. It's just two premises. So, there must be something wrong, right? I mean, that's the kind of, I think that's the, it's like, how can a two-premise argument, and these are premises that most people think, yes, of course these premises are right. How does that get us this ridiculous conclusion? And so I have to go through all these objections and say, well, look, here, it still stands. So here's another objection that has been leveled sometimes. It has to do with the formulation of being subject to coercion. Some people say, well, look, I'm relying on such an expansive idea of being subject to coercion that it's so expansive that actually it's not a very useful assumption. And here's what the evidence is supposed to be for why it is so expansive. Some people say to me, well, look, if being subject to coercion, which is supposed to trigger a right of democratic say, includes whenever you are subject to a standing threat, for example, of violence by the state, unless you comply with the state's directives, that means, actually, that all of the domestic laws of a particular country themselves subject everybody in the world to coercion. And why do people say this to me? Sometimes they say this because they say, look, for example, Canada has a law that says you have to drive on the right side of the road. Now it looks like everybody in the world, on my account, is subject to coercion. Because, why? Because if you don't drive on the right side of the road, the police will arrest you, right? And then they'll impose fines. If you don't pay them, you go to jail. So it looks like everybody in the world is subject to coercion. Because why? Because if you drive on the left side of the road in Canada, you'll be arrested. So should everybody now in the world have a right to participate in Canada's determination of its traffic laws? And the answer is no, because it's a misinterpretation of the nature of the law. Why is it a misinterpretation? Let me give you two, and again, here's where philosophical analysis I think is very useful. Let me give you two formulations of what the law is. One formulation is that the law requires, and now I'm going to put everything in parentheses about what the law requires. The law requires, if you're in Canada, drive on the right side. If that's the nature of the law, everybody is subject to it in the world. Because it says to everybody in the world, if you're in Canada, drive on the right side of the road. And what that means is that you can fulfill this in two ways. You can comply with the law in two ways. One is when you're in Canada, you drive on the right, or don't come to Canada, in which case you also comply with the law, right? Because the law says, in parentheses, if in Canada, drive on the right side. And all of us right now are complying with that law, right? We're not violating, we're complying. Okay, here's a different formulation. That's in the technical language, that's called a wide scope formulation of the normativity of the directive. Okay? So here's a different formulation. If in Canada, the law says, and now we have the directive, drive on the right side. In other words, the directive only arises once you're in Canada. It's only directed, right? And now there's only one way that you can comply with the law. Is if you're in Canada, you drive on the right side. we're not complying with that law because the law does not apply to us. That is the nature of most of the domestic laws of a country, is that they are narrow scope. We can tell because actually there's only one way to comply, and sometimes there are rewards for complying. So in Canada, if you comply with the traffic laws, you often get points on your driver's license. You are not going to get points on your driver's license because you're not complying with the law because the law is not directed to you. Okay? As I said, in the first wide scope formulation, there are two ways of complying. Somebody else, for example, who doesn't have a driver's license, who's in Canada, who does have a driver's license but never drives, may still get a lot of points. Okay? Because it's okay. So much for the, this is just a crazy notion of being subject to coercion. It's not a crazy notion. What it points out is that border laws are distinct. They're different from normal domestic laws. Border laws are directed towards everybody that's in the world, basically. They're different. There are other laws that are like this. Sometimes, some states claim universal jurisdiction in human rights. Or the U.S. claims, often they claim sort of universal jurisdiction over certain sanctions that they're imposing on various countries. If any companies in the world violate these laws, right, then yes, those laws are directed to everybody. That's true. Everybody is subject to the coercion of the U.S. state in those cases, and we can ask about whether that's democratically legitimate. That's the point about border laws. It's not true about most of the domestic laws of a country. Okay. Let me take up one other potential objection, which I think is actually a very important objection. And this is a kind of reductio ad absurdum of my thesis, an attempt at a reductio ad absurdum. And this is to say, well, look, what about cases of self-defense? Is it the case that if a country is, let's say, bent on invading our country and engaging in military force against them, and therefore we want to subject them to coercion, we're making coercive threats against them, in fact, we will deploy our army to defend ourselves and so on, does the democratic legitimacy say that now we have to involve those potential invaders in the political process of determining whether we're going to declare war on them? This looks absurd. And it looks like the kind of argument that I'm giving lends itself to that kind of conclusion. And what I want to do is I want to actually concede that this is a valid point. That this shows us the limits of the value of democratic legitimacy. Democratic legitimacy is not the only value in political philosophy that is relevant for determining how political power is exercised. There are going to be cases where democratic legitimacy is not feasible, and that there are other forms of legitimacy that may justify coercive action on the part of the state, and may justify those who are subject to coercion to not try to overthrow the state institutions to which they are subject. Okay? So I want to concede, in fact, that democratic legitimacy is not the sole value that is relevant for thinking about political philosophy, and that there may be considerations of self-defense that may outweigh or even trump considerations of democratic legitimacy under certain circumstances. However, what I want to suggest to you, and this is a preliminary thought that I have, and I'd be interested actually, especially here in this university, for feedback on thinking about this. I think the upshot of this kind of an argument is to point out something about the nature of these kinds of argument, about the unilateral right to impose a coercive regime of border control against foreigners. I think essentially the conditions under which this is justifiable are conditions where it is justifiable to declare war on foreigners. In other words, this kind of justification is essentially the same kind of justification that's required in just war theory. And so I think it's important to see that actually this kind of an argument goes back to Francisco de Vitoria, who also thought that there was a kind of right of hospitality, and that to close unilaterally borders to foreigners in some way is equivalent to a declaration of war against them. And so I think what's complicated and interesting about this kind of an argument, an appeal to this principle, and recognizing its complicated and difficult history, of course, is that although Victoria, you might think, was trying to moderate the nature of Spanish colonial violence against the population in the Americas, the indigenous population in the Americas, there is a kind of danger in the kind of argument, the premise that he's appealing to, right? Which is this kind of right of hospitality, because it was also used by the Spanish to justify various aspects of the colonial project. Okay, so I recognize that this is a kind of a fraught topic, and that's in particular why I'm interested to hear sort of your response to this appeal that I'm making. Just to be clear, what the appeal is, I'm suggesting that the appeal to a right of self-defense as a way to assert a unilateral right of border control against foreigners, as a way of leaving aside considerations of democratic legitimacy, may work, but that they work under conditions that are analogous to a declaration of war against foreigners. And so we'd have to think about, what are the conditions in which that is legitimate. So I think maybe, let me just see if I want to stop there. Yes, I think I will stop there to give time for some discussion.
Very nice talk. So we have time for comments. Yes,
thank you. I am fairly sympathetic to the project and the main idea, but I would like to press a point of the second objection that you considered, the idea that your notion of coercive exercise of political power is too broad and might overreach in general. It seems that you concede that, for example, the trade policy of the U.S. might affect and might be coercively imposed to other countries, and in that sense it will have to be justified to those people in those countries, according to your notion of democratic legitimacy. And I suppose you would think the same of foreign policy in general. That seems to be already a strong commitment, but let me try to put it in a more specific way to your topic of borders. Suppose that a country allows only certain type of immigrants with certain political views that will affect directly the foreign policy of the country. Does that mean, and as we know already, that foreign policy will be coercively imposed according to your notion to us, does that mean that we all in the world should have a say in which immigrants should enter to the country? Because depending on which political views they have, we will be coerced by them in certain ways.
Great, so that's a great question. So one of my worries about the question is that I'm worried that you're imputing to the position that I'm taking a concern with an all-affected interests principle, and that's not what I'm doing, right? So I'm not saying, oh, if certain kind of foreigners enter into a country, that's going to affect foreigners in a different way. So it's not that if a polity, it certainly may be the case that downstream, the kind of immigrants a country takes is going to affect others in virtue of their foreign policy. But it's not the case that in virtue of allowing certain people to come into the country, that you thereby, in that act, have subjected all these other people to coercion. And that's what I'm concerned with. Now, if it turns out that downstream, this polity, as a result of having let these particular kinds of migrants in the country, wants to engage in foreign policy that does subject others to coercion in a certain way, that's when we can start talking. And that's where, you're right, my argument, I think the general normative position that I'm taking is that for certain kinds of foreign policy, including the imposition of trade regimes on other states, including the imposition of certain kind of property regime on other states. So think here of intellectual property rights, the way that they're imposed on various states by more powerful states, that these suffer from democratic legitimacy. So the question is, right, are there other values in the interstate sphere that are more important than democratic legitimacy, for example, when determining the interstate regime of property rights? That's an interesting question. But what I want to do for the purpose of this argument, is to say yes, there's a democratic legitimacy problem in those cases. What the overall, all things considered, upshot is going to be relevant. It's going to be a different issue. And I've suggested to you that one of the ways in which you can put aside, if you like, or de-emphasize considerations of democratic legitimacy is in a condition of self-defense, which justifies war against foreigners. So that's the nature of that's the structure of the argument as I see it. But what's important for me is to recognize that these are affronts against democratic legitimacy. Then it's a further argument about whether, how important is democratic legitimacy in a